those facts. There's 100 scenarios as to why this happened, and none of them are good. Okay, those are all facts, and we can draw conclusions as to why they were and what happened, okay? But here's the truth. We will always have criminals. We will always have thieves. We'll always have corrupt politicians, businessmen who cheat their employees, employees who steal from their employers. We'll always have drunkards. We'll always have druggies. We'll always have lazy louts, bad actors from all walks of life. This is always going to happen. Now, the fact that these were all black, all four of these youth were black and under the age of 18 and from the city, does not mean that all people from the city or all black people or all young people are bad people. What it means is it's a snapshot for bad people attempting to do something bad to one bad person or one good person, and it could have turned out worse, but the criminals were apprehended. That's all it means. That's all it means. And to look into it as something other than that is being very disingenuous. Because again, we'll always have criminals and thieves. We'll always have corrupt politicians, but that doesn't mean all politicians are corrupt. We'll always have businessmen who cheat their employees, but that doesn't mean all businessmen are out to cheat their employees. We'll always have employees who steal from their employers. That doesn't mean that everybody who works for somebody is out to steal their fair share from the man. And drunkards and druggies and lazy louts and bad actors, etc. Okay? The most important thing to remember is that all these actions, they're all in the minority. Most people don't do this. Most politicians are not terribly corrupt. Most businessmen don't steal from their employees. Most employees don't steal from their employers, etc., etc., etc. The bad actors in this society, in this country, are the minority. And they should not be tolerated. But they must not be lumped into an all-inclusive group. Because when we do that, then we paint everybody with the same broad brush. Now, we still have it extremely well in this country, even with that ugly story that happened out here, okay? Now, you don't believe me? Here's how I'm going to put it. How can you judge goodness compared to badness? We will never have nirvana. Nirvana is something that comes out of a fairy tale book, okay? We'll never have that here. It's never been, it never will be, okay? But that doesn't mean you can always strive for perfection, with the understanding that you will never get there, okay? You can always strive to be better. Now, how good are we? Well, America is the number one economy in the world. The number one economy in the world. Who do we compare this to? How about the number two economy in the world? The U.S. is number one. Number two is China. And today's essay examines a true dictator, a true communist, a true despot. His name is Xi Jinping, the premier of China. Now, the following accounts, stories, whatever you want to call them, were compiled from just the last 7 days in the Wall Street Journal and written by a variety of journalists. In fact, I will read all of them because they did good work. I don't want to slight their work because I took their stories and I turned this into my essay. The people who worked on the stories that I referenced for this podcast: Chong Kon Ping, Lisa Ling, Drew Hinshaw, Sha Hua, and Lawrence Norman. Those are the journalists who put this stuff together. And again, it's for the Wall Street Journal, which I consider the Wall Street Journal being the most fair, the most comprehensive publication that's out there. Unfortunately, many of you can't read it because there's a firewall they put up. They want their money. I pay $40 a month to read this thing, okay? And it's worth every penny, okay? And again, These three stories are for your consideration. The first one has to do with a U.S. government property deal. Now, sometime 6 months ago, I want to say, the United States bought a new group of apartments for their diplomats. Okay, for years and years and years, they stayed in one place. They wanted to move, so in fact, the footprint is much smaller. There's much fewer diplomats. There are many fewer diplomats in Hong Kong than there used to be, so the United States government didn't need that big of a footprint, so they bought a smaller compound and are in the process of selling the bigger one. Now, the U.S. government's planned $332 million sale of an exclusive property in Hong Kong was thrown into doubt by the Chinese government, which is determined that the transaction needs government approval, Chinese government approval. Now, back in September, the U.S. reached a deal to sell a residential compound for consulate staff to Hang Lung Properties Limited. That's a Hong Kong real estate developer. Now, the scenic property in a high-end neighborhood on Susan Hill included 6 low-rise buildings with 26 apartments and a rooftop swimming pool. Okay, and again, it housed diplomats, and the other property had been purchased for them to move to because it needed a smaller footprint, less people. It was a money-saving deal, okay? Now, a representative of the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong previously said the sale of Susan Hill compound was purely a result of a business decision made as part of a global investment program by the U.S. Department of State. Now, the deal didn't close on December 30th as scheduled because on Wednesday of this week, 2 days ago, Hang Lung Properties said it was informed last week by Hong Kong's Land Regency that the sale can't be completed without written consent of the Chinese government. Now, it added the sale of a compound involves foreign affairs between the People's Republic of China and the U.S. and should not be regarded as an ordinary commercial activity. The letter said China's central government had advised Hong Kong's government that the U.S. needs to make a written application at least 60 days before renting, buying, or selling any property in Hong Kong. It also said the U.S. needs written consent from the central government before proceeding with any transaction. Now, the U.S. has contested the necessity to comply with requirements, but agreed that the transaction involving foreign affairs and diplomatic matters is true. That's according to Hang Lung's filing. Now, on Wednesday, 2 days ago, a spokesman for the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong said additional time is needed for the buyer and seller to complete the administrative process required for the closing of the property. Now, the State Department is not at liberty to comment on the specific terms of the ongoing contractual transactions. Now, Susan Hill property was acquired by the U.S. government back in 1948, and that's when Hong Kong was under British rule. Hang Lung Properties has hoped to redevelop the almost 95,000 square foot site into luxury detached homes. Now, what does this mean? These are new rules set up by China, further eroding Hong Kong's one country, two systems agreement that was signed when the British hand this over to the communist government back in 1998, I want to say. Now, is this just a hassle, or will the whole deal be nixed, or just taxed, or forced to sell at a lesser amount? I don't know, but it's certainly something new, and time will tell. Number 2 is to how, now again, does this stuff happen in this country? Not so much. The government just doesn't come and say, you know what, we're going to stick our nose into a private deal like this that was already done. The Chinese government knew this was happening, and at the 11th hour decided to nix it. That's what happens in China. It doesn't necessarily happen here. Another story, and it has to do with how President Xi is crafting a campaign to boast youth patriotism in the People's Republic of China. Now, way back in the era of Mao Zedong, China had used propaganda posters to urge young people to create a great socialist nation. Now, after the Tiananmen Square protests back in 1989, the Communist Party rewrote textbooks to deliver its version of history and to steer its young away from Western ideas. In other words, in China, you cannot reference Tiananmen Square. When I was there, I tried. You Google it on Chinese Google, because it's different from regular Google, and it says, sorry, no results found. Now, today in China, today China is embarked on another campaign to re-educate its young people. The message is more blatantly nationalistic than anything in recent decades, and President Xi Jinping's image is often at the center. And it's far more sophisticated than anything Beijing has attempted in the past. Slick videos on social media notch millions of views on the of Chinese people. In fact, one episode of a popular video is called The Year Hare Affair. Hare like as in rabbit. And it's co-produced by a Communist Party organization. It features a bald eagle dressed in an American flag plotting with talking cockroaches to create chaos in Hong Kong. And cute little Japanese or Chinese rabbits show up to fight off the cockroaches. Now, do we have stuff in this country like that? Sure. But this is a state-produced video. The U.S. Department of State doesn't produce videos like that, okay? Now, Pat Boree, who's a 19-year-old freshman at a Beijing college, got hooked last year on the cartoons. And he says they will shape the thinking of the next generation of Chinese. He said he knew they were made with party support, but said Chinese still consider them very accurate and more accessible than traditional news reports. Interesting. Chinese leaders have always tried to encourage patriotism. Leaders of all countries do. But in Mao's era, young people learned about Mao Zedong thought and class struggle and sang revolutionary songs. And curriculum changes from the early 1990s began spreading the narrative that China was suffering at the hands of the West. Now, polls of university students about a decade ago showed that many of those saw efforts as clumsy and transparent. Many identified themselves as holding liberal or Western political views. Now, previous leaders, such as Hu Jintao, and he was Mr. Xi's predecessor, previous leaders were wary of publishing propaganda too hard, fearing that it could inflame nationalism in ways that might destabilize China. They wanted to speed economic development and were willing to allow some debate over Western ideas. Remember that? I do. Now, under Xi, patriotic education has become sharper and more widespread. Chinese authorities learned from recent unrest among teenagers and young adults in Hong Kong that indoctrination has to start young. And that's according to Stanley Rosen. He's a Chinese political professor at the University of Southern California, USC. Mr. Rosen says, we need to seize this critical period that determines and forms teenagers' values and guides them so that they can do life's first buckle. That's what Mr. Rosen says Mr. Xi said. Mr. Xi explained at an August 2018 meeting. Now, Beijing's ambitions are laid out in a document published by the State Council, China's cabinet. This was back in November of last year. This was back in November of 2019, which says, patriotism is the most natural and simple emotion of the Chinese. We must insist on starting from when they were babies, focusing on consolidating the roots and concentrating on the soul. I think that's called brainwashing. Now, the 9,000-word document includes instructions from the government and party officials to promote movies, news, and classroom lessons with Mr. Xi's ideology and his plans for China's rejuvenation. It calls for authorities to capitalize on teenagers' interests in online games, animation, and short videos so patriotism can fill the internet space. In other words, young people are going to go onto the internet, so just make sure that everything they see is slanted in the right way. The military correspondent, that's a news journal sponsored by the People's Liberation Army, has said China's military must increase the use of social media platforms, which it calls gathering places for young users. Again, reinforcing the last statement. Surveys suggest that younger Chinese people are fiercely patriotic and more loyal to their country than previous generations. Academics, parents, and teenagers said in interviews that young people have had many reasons to be proud of China, including its economic growth and success in containing COVID-19. Now, one kindergarten in the eastern Chinese city of Hangzhou, where I've been, interpressed its lessons in September